This is Client Facilitator training for tax year 2021, and this training supplements the Tax-Aide policies and procedures training, which is required for all AARP Foundation Tax-Aide volunteers. The lesson topics for today, the Client Facilitator's role we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about the requirements that Client Facilitators have, also the various tasks that they typically do each year. We're going to talk about the intake booklet, and we're also going to talk about various other job aids that client facilitators may or may not have at their disposal. The goal of this training is to ensure that client facilitators are adequately prepared to effectively function in their role at their local site. And the training objectives for client facilitators, there are three of them. We're going to understand the essential role at the site that the client facilitators have, understand duties and requirements, and enhance their knowledge of the available resources and tools. What is the role of the client facilitator? Well, first of all, they're there to aid the local coordinator with site administration and various tasks associated with site administration. Secondly, they're there to aid the counselors by verifying that the taxpayers are indeed ready for the tax return work to begin for that particular taxpayer. They're also there because they're the first point of contact for the taxpayers. So they're there to make taxpayers feel comfortable and help taxpayers to understand what the process involves. The client facilitator is the primary communicator with taxpayers that are waiting to be served. At times, taxpayers do have to wait, and unfortunately, at times, taxpayers can get a little impatient, and the client facilitator can be very useful in helping taxpayers to stay calm and reassure them that they'll be served fairly soon. Also, the client facilitator has the role of explaining the Tax-Aide process to the taxpayers as far as what the various site procedures are, what the counselor's role is in preparing tax returns, the quality review process and how that works, and also return filing, whether a return is e-filed or mailed in, making it clear to the taxpayer that we make every effort to e-file their tax return. But in some cases, if they need to be mailed in, we handle that as well. Here is a fairly generic view of the flow of information when a taxpayer shows up at a site, showing up at the front door and then being welcomed and greeted, and then going to a client facilitator and having their time logged in. So the process is not necessarily the same at each site. This is a fairly good representation of what takes place in Marshfield, but other sites may vary a little bit from this, but essentially the basics are all there. You can see that if at any point during the process, if we discover that there's a missing document, we don't have everything that we need to prepare the return. In many cases, the client does need to leave and get the necessary documentation that we're missing. But apart from that, you can see the flow from here. In some cases, at some sites, there are client facilitators that are also certified as counselors. And in those cases, they have the client facilitators have a little more bandwidth as far as what they can do. But for client facilitators that do not have that advanced certification, they are restricted as far as answering any tax law questions. They're not to answer any tax law questions. They're not to involve themselves in tax preparation with the taxpayer. And then not to give any tax advice to taxpayers. And there really are no exceptions. But here again, if the client facilitator has the counselor certification, then they are permitted to do those three things. What are the benefits of a client facilitator to the taxpayer? Well, first of all, they're there to create a pleasant, welcoming atmosphere at the site. Secondly, they're there to calm worried or impatient taxpayers, and they're there to make the counselor's job easier, and indeed they do that. They're there also to bring order to the administration task at the site. And sites, in order to operate smoothly, have a lot of tasks that have to be handled, and the client facilitators are essential in doing those tasks. Client facilitators ultimately lead to increased site productivity by identifying problems early and making the local coordinator aware of what potential problems may exist. They also free local coordinators to concentrate on site management and or assisting counselors when necessary, or talking with taxpayers about particular issues. So the client facilitators are essential in helping with that. They also allow the counselors to be more productive. Counselors don't have to spend their time sorting out taxpayer documents because that's already been done for them. So they can be much more productive than they would be in an environment where there were no client facilitators. So what kind of individual would make a good client facilitator? Well, first of all, it takes someone that is personable, someone that's well organized, someone that's very patient with other people, and someone that's very diligent about what they do. Along with that, with the proper training and the training as far as tax-aide policies and site procedures, once they have that knowledge to go along with those other traits that I just described, then they become well-qualified client facilitators. And they don't need to be certified as counselors. However, if they are, that just adds another feather in the cap, so to speak, and they're even more qualified. So they can be extremely helpful to the site if they have that counselor certification. So what is required of someone that wants to become a client facilitator in a Tax-Aide Tax-Aide site? First of all, you have to complete the AARP Foundation Tax-Aide Policy and Procedures training, which can be found on the AARP volunteer portal by going to a tab called Training and looking at the learning management system modules that are available. There's a module called the Tax-Aide Policy and Procedures. That has to be taken by all Tax-Aide volunteers each year. So that's the first requirement. The second and third are two tests that are on the IRS Link Learn Certification.org website. And that is the Volunteer Standards of Conduct test, as well as the intake/interview and quality review test. Both of those tests are on the IRS Link Learn certification website. Those two tests, by the way, are very straightforward and very common sense, and usually do not give people any kind of problem as far as passing them. They're pretty easy to pass. You do have to be familiar with the various things. There is reading material that is available also on that same website that you can read to get prepared for the tests. But I think once you've taken these tests from year to year, they don't change really, and you can pretty much take them without doing that reading every year. So at the very end, once you've done that, then you sign the volunteer agreement that's also found on that Link Learn certification website. And it's the form 13615. Once you've signed that, and you sign that electronically, it can be mailed to your local coordinator who can then check you off the list as far as having met that requirement. On this slide, you can see the linklearncertification.com webpage. And you can see that over on the left-hand side, you can, if you've been on this site before, if you've certified in years past, you can simply put in your username and your password, assuming that you've remembered your password. If you have not remembered your password, if you look at the fifth arrow down, it says forgot password, and you can click on that and you can give yourself a new password. However, if you've logged in before, you can log in with the same credentials year after year. And then once you put your credentials in under username and password, you can click on sign in, the third arrow down. If you've never been on before, you can create an account with the fourth arrow, and you can click on the create account and just go ahead and enter the information to create your account for the first time. So that's everything as far as being able to log into the VITA TCE Central. Over on the right-hand side, you can see that I've put a couple of arrows pointing to a couple of important things. The VSOC training is the Volunteer Standards of Conduct training, and then you can also see the intake/interview and quality review training. Both of those tests you need to take, and so this brings you to the reading that's required to get prepared to take the tests, to take both of those tests. So that's about all you need to know for this page. So we'll move on to the next page. Once you're logged into your account on VITA TCE Central, you will then be brought to the Circular 230 tab, and that's fine. You can just stay right there, and you can see that you have your 2021 Volunteer Standards of Conduct exam and your 2021 intake and interview and quality review exam. So both of those exams are there ready for you to take. The third exam you do not need to bother with, the 2021 federal tax law test. That doesn't apply to client facilitators. It's really only the top two tests that do. So if you take those top two tests and you look at everything I've circled on the right-hand side, top one saying you may sign your volunteer agreement electronically by checking this box. I do recommend that you check that box so that you can print out a signed volunteer agreement and send it to your local coordinator. And that's the second ellipse down. It says click here to open and complete your volunteer agreement. Click print from the file menu to print the page. Save the volunteer agreement for your records. So this is where you create a PDF file of your volunteer agreement and just save it. You can save it to your desktop. You can save it to anywhere you want. And then you can then email it to your local coordinator. And on this page also, there are the same links that you have on the first page that I showed you in the last slide. If you would like to review the information for the Volunteer Standards of Conduct and also the intake interview, you can get to that reading material on the right-hand side. And that's about all you need to know, really, to take the IRS certification tests. The only other thing that you need to do is you need to do policy and procedure training, which I explained earlier. Client facilitator tasks. One of the first tasks that the client facilitator is involved with is to verify that all of the required posters and required forms are displayed and available at the site for each session. I have images of the various posters, which you will see in the next few slides, so just hold on for that. The second task is that you're going to greet and welcome taxpayers, help them to feel comfortable at the site. Thirdly, you're going to ensure that taxpayers are serviced in the order of their appointment time. This varies a little bit from site to site, so this is more geared toward Marshfield at this point. In Marshfield, we have appointment times where you may have 2 or possibly even 3 people coming in for the same appointment time. In situations like that, you need to be very sensitive to the fact that one of the 3 may have arrived earlier than the others, and so we need to take them in order of their arrival time. So someone at the site needs to keep track of when people arrive, and then when people have essentially the same appointment time, you need to make sure that you take the one that arrived first. Next is to explain the tax return preparation process to the taxpayer, and so that they feel more comfortable knowing exactly what's going to take place. Also, you need to aid the local coordinator if there are any special needs that taxpayers may have. You have people that come in, especially elderly taxpayers, that may have special needs. And if it's something that the client facilitator can help with, they should do that. If it's something that goes beyond what the client facilitator can implement, then they need to let the local coordinator knows so that the local coordinator can get involved. So now I have the images coming up in the next few slides. This is the 2022 COVID-19 notice for on-site services. This is a poster that is required this year for the first time, and it pretty much covers the AARP Foundation Tax-Aide for liability, so that as long as this is posted at the site, then the AARP Foundation is not liable for anything that may happen with regard to the spreading of COVID-19 or anything of that nature. So you can read through this at your leisure. This is supposed to be a 24 by 36 inch poster, but at this point I have downloaded this from the volunteer portal, and I'm not sure whether the 24 by 36 poster is actually going to be available for us to order, but I'm hoping it will be. So it's actually going to be quite large, and we'll be posting it at the site. We may be taking it down when the site's not operating and then putting it back up. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. But that's the first of the images that I have. This is another required document that's going to need to be at each site. And this is the CDC poster on how to protect yourself and others. So it gets into exactly what you should be doing as far as getting vaccinated, wearing a mask, staying 6 feet apart, et cetera, et cetera. This is page 1 of the CDC poster. So it's going to be a double-sided poster, 8.5, 11. And the next slide is the second page. Here's the CDC poster, second page. Wash your hands, cover coughs and sneezes, clean and disinfect, monitor your health daily. So that's a CDC poster. Here's a document that really should be at the desk of the client facilitator, so that any new taxpayer that comes in, any taxpayer that comes in to be serviced, should be aware of what we can and cannot do as far as tax return complexity. So this goes into a very brief summary of what's in scope and what's out of scope. There's a lot more involved with scope than just what we see on here, but these are really the big ones that seem to get people caught up in them. So I usually put this in an acrylic picture stand that I put on each table so that taxpayers can very easily read this thing as they're waiting for their client facilitator to help them. This document here is the taxpayer information and responsibilities. This document needs to be at every station. So where every tax preparer, every client facilitator, every single desk that you have at your site should have one of these clearly visible there so that the taxpayers can easily read it. Essentially, what this document says is that the taxpayer is responsible for their tax return and that we are there to help them, but ultimately the responsibility lies with them. So if there's anything wrong with that tax return going forward, it's really the taxpayer's responsibility and not ours. That's the bottom line. Now, there's a lot more, obviously a lot more detail in here than that, so you can read that on your own. But this is one of the 3 documents that needs to be clearly visible at every site and at every station. This is the AARP Foundation Tax-Aide anti-discrimination poster. It's actually much longer than what you see here because I couldn't get it all on one slide. This is the top part of the poster, and this is used primarily to just put information about the site, when it opens, who to call to make an appointment, that kind of thing. So the next slide is going to be the bottom part, which is actually the non-discrimination verbiage. So here, especially at the bottom of the poster, you can see all of the legalese that talks about discrimination and what to do if you feel that you've been discriminated against. So this is absolutely required that it be displayed at the site, and if it isn't, the local coordinator could be dinged by the Internal Revenue Service and by the AARP as well for not having that displayed at the site. So very important. But typically the client facilitator may not be very much involved in this. I mean, this is the kind of thing that gets posted at the beginning of the season and really just kind of stays there for the rest of the season. So it's not something that you have to put up and take down every time. I guess it depends on your site. I mean, some sites may require you to do that, but I know in the Marshfield Senior Center, we post it at the beginning of the season, stays up all season. The client facilitator is going to verify that the taxpayer and the spouse identification documents are essentially, they're going to check to make sure that the taxpayer is who they say they are. So they're going to check their photo ID, and they're also going to check their social security cards. If they don't have the social security cards with them, they can check their SSA 1099s, which will have the social security number on it. Either one of those two things will work for. Also, they can also use a prior year tax return. So if they have a prior year tax return that was filed electronically, we can use that as proof of their social security number. So they do need a picture ID in all cases, but when it comes to a social security card, we can get by with an SSA 1099 or with a prior year e-filed tax return. If they have a prior year tax return that's filled out by hand, I'm reluctant to accept something like that as verification of their social security number. It has to be an electronically filed one. So those are the things that we can use to verify their identity. We also have to verify that taxpayers have all their required tax documents for the appropriate tax year. So for 2021, we expect them to have their 2021 tax documents that we will then arrange. We have to be a little bit careful with arranging documents. Some people are very sensitive about rearranging their documents. They may bring in documents that are all very neatly organized in the way that the taxpayer thinks they need to be organized. That may not be the way we want to have them organized for our counselors. So we have to be a little careful because we have had people in the past that have kind of gone ballistic, let's say, because they're so anal retentive that if we start changing the order of their documents compared to how they had them organized, they get very, so you're walking a fine line with some people, and we have to essentially talk them into changing the order of the documents. So another problem that we have with documents is that oftentimes taxpayers will bring us documents from different years. So we have to be very careful that for 2021, we're pulling out the 2021 documents and putting aside the 2020 or the 2019 documents, anything else that we find in it that's not 2021. So it has to be the appropriate year. And we also have to make sure that they have the prior year tax return with them, especially if they're a new taxpayer that we haven't dealt with in the past. It's essential that we have the prior year tax return so that we have some basis to start from. For people that we've done in the past, if push came to shove, we could go into our system and actually print out a tax return if we need it. So I wouldn't be so adamant about needing the prior year tax return if there's somebody that we've dealt with before, because we usually have that information at our fingertips. So that's it for that. We have more tasks on the next slide. We need to make sure that the taxpayer completes the intake booklet. Very, very important. The intake booklet has to be filled out. In Marshfield, we have people come to the senior center and pick up an intake booklet well in advance of their appointment and have them fill it out at home and bring it with them to their appointment. But it does need to be filled out, and if they haven't filled it out in advance, then we need to find them a table to sit at and fill it out when they get to their appointment. So however it's handled at your site, it certainly needs to be done. We don't allow the use of prior year intake booklets. Many taxpayers think that they can just, oh, nothing's changed. You can just use my last year's intake booklet. We don't allow that. They have to fill out a new one each year. And we also have to ensure that the taxpayer completes the town release form in Marshfield. That's a requirement in Marshfield. It probably is not a requirement in other towns. So there is a town release form in Marshfield. It releases the town from any responsibility. And we need to review the intake booklet for completeness. And the client facilitator does not answer tax questions. They are not tax experts and should not be answering tax questions. I know there's a temptation in many cases to answer questions, but please do not. Get a counselor or get your local coordinator to answer any tax questions that people might have. Unless, of course, the client facilitator is certified as a counselor. In some cases, that's true. Ensure that every applicable question on the answer sheet is answered either yes or no or unsure. But if anything is marked unsure, if the client facilitator has the ability to get that straightened out with the taxpayer so that we can turn it into a yes or a no, you should be doing that. Now, if you're not sure, if you yourself are not sure, as well as the taxpayer, then you need to get a more experienced tax person involved. So you need to convert unsures to yeses or nos if you possibly can. But as I said, if you're not sure yourself, then you need to get either the local coordinator or a counselor involved. This is a tool that we created in Marshfield a few years back. We had a client facilitator who asked us to do something to create some sort of a checklist that so she wouldn't forget to do any particular part of her function. So we created this a few years back, and it has been useful to her and to many other client facilitators as well. So we've kept it going, and we probably will keep it going from here on. We change it every year a little bit to coincide with some of the changes in the tax law. For instance, we have a question here at the very beginning. Did taxpayer buy, sell, hold, or conduct any transactions using virtual currency? That question is all important and needs to be asked of each and every taxpayer this year and probably from this year on. Virtual currency is a big thing now in the United States and around the world. So the problem is that with Tax-Aide, virtual currency makes the tax return out of scope. So if a taxpayer is either transacting or selling or even holding virtual currency, the tax return's out of scope, and then it would have to be escalated to the local coordinator, who would then make a decision as far as or politely tell the taxpayer that they need to get their taxes done by someone else. So that's an important question this year and moving forward. So one of the qualifications here, however, is that if somebody has a mutual fund, if somebody has a brokerage account and has a mutual fund or like an exchange traded fund, an ETF that conducts business in virtual currency, that's okay. So if it's a virtual currency mutual fund or a virtual currency ETF within their portfolio, we can do that. However, if they're actually transacting themselves using virtual currency, then it's out of scope. So that's the qualification of that. So as we go down the list here on this tool, returning Marshfield tax year 2020 client. So we're interested in finding out whether this is somebody that we did their taxes last year, because the information will come forward in TaxSlayer, our computer-based program. The basic information as far as name, address, and telephone number and all of that information will come forward from last year's tax return. If, however, they did not come to us last year, then we're going to end up having to input this data from scratch. So preparers are always interested in knowing this, so we ask that question right up front. Then we go, the facilitator goes ahead and explains the process to the taxpayer. Is there an SSA 1099 available from the Social Security Administration? Yes or no? Then we check off the ID check when we check the taxpayer's identification and the spouse's identification. The intake booklet, is it complete? Is the mass intake intake sheet complete as well? We check those things off. Prior year return available. So if the taxpayer has brought in the prior year return, we check yes on that. Mortgage interest. We're interested in knowing about mortgage interest and medical expenses because we want to get some idea as to whether this taxpayer may qualify for itemized deductions or not. So if they have large mortgage interest and significant medical expenses, they would probably qualify for itemized deductions. Is the checkbook available for doing direct deposit, for instance, or direct debit? 2020 documents organized. So once the documents are organized, we can check that box off. IRS letter 1444C or 6475 included. That's the letter that relates to the economic impact payment number 3. Child under 18, IRS letter 6419. So somebody may have gotten the advanced child tax payment, child tax credit that started back in July and started paying monthly payments to the taxpayer. So we'd want to see that in letter 6419 in that situation. Purchased health insurance from Health Connector, we want to know about that. And the 1095A is the form that they would have received if they had purchased health insurance from the Health Connector. Property tax receipts available, yes or no. Water and sewer receipts available, yes or no, for the circuit breaker credit. And any scope issues, if so, escalate to the local coordinator. So client facilitator should know that if they find something that could be out of scope, the local coordinator needs to get involved. So that's the tool that I developed a few years back, and we've used it pretty successfully over the last few years. And it's available for any other site to either use as a model for creating their own, or they can use the one that we have. I'm certainly willing to share it. So let's talk about the intake booklet. The intake booklet is really the focal point of what we do at each site as far as the taxpayer information that we gather. So it's comprised of 8 pages. Pages 1 to 3 are the IRS interview/intake sheet. So that's the IRS. The AARP hasn't added anything to pages 1 through 3. That's all strictly IRS information. Page 4 is optional questions for the AARP Foundation. Page 5 is how to use this intake booklet. Page 6 is the consent to disclose tax return information to VITA TCE tax preparation sites. Page 7 is the consent to disclose information to AARP Foundation itself. Page 8 is the consent for AARP Foundation to use select tax return information to provide you with additional information about other free AARP Foundation programs or services. So that's the 8 pages of the intake booklet as it stands for 2021. The first 3 pages of the intake booklet are essentially very similar from one year to the next. There are usually a few changes due to the tax law changes each year, but for the most part, the information doesn't change a whole lot. Client facilitators are very helpful in working with taxpayers or talking with taxpayers to try to clear up any of the unsure answers that taxpayers have on page 2. In some cases, client facilitators can't get to the yes or no answer, and they can leave them marked unsure, and then the counselor, when the taxpayer gets to the counselor will ask further questions and eventually get those answers to be yes or no. Counselors will also, if you look at page 1, we'll look at the first page of the intake booklet in just a few minutes. But you'll notice that on page 1, there's a dark gray area in the lower right corner that says to be completed by a certified volunteer preparer. And it asks questions like, is this person a qualifying child or relative of any other person? Did this person provide more than 50% of his or her own support? So questions in that gray area are designed so that a counselor can establish what the filing status for this taxpayer will be. And it's not something that the client facilitator can do, so they must leave that for a certified counselor. If you review the intake booklet, client facilitators need to review the intake booklet and look for anything that might be out of scope. And they will have a scope manual. Each client facilitator should have a scope manual provided by their local coordinator so that if they see a particular document in the taxpayer's pile of documents, they may see something that looks odd or unusual. They can consult the out of scope manual to find out whether this particular form may be out of scope. Scope issues vary from one site to another. Anything that a counselor has not been trained on is considered to be out of scope. So out of scope conditions can change quite a bit from one site to another, and it really depends a lot on the local coordinator as well. So even though something may be marked in the scope manual as being in scope for Tax-Aide, a particular local coordinator may consider it to be out of scope if there is no one in his team, his or her team, that has training in that particular area. So also cryptocurrency or virtual currency you notice it's highlighted on the screen, and we need to make the point this year that it is always out of scope for Tax-Aide. Cryptocurrency is always out of scope. So if a taxpayer is holding any virtual currency such as Bitcoin or anything like that, or they had any transactions in tax year 2021 that involved Bitcoin or any other virtual currency, we'll have to send them to a paid preparer to have the tax return done. So on the next screen, let's move right along. So here's an image of page 1 of the intake booklet. You can see that it has sort of a peach colored top this year. Every year they change the color. Last year it was green. So the basic information really doesn't change as far as names and addresses. Are you a citizen? Your address, mailing address, date of birth, all of those things. Also asks you for marital information. Never married, married, divorced, legally separated. So pretty easy for most people to fill out page 1 and put their people that live with them under list of names below of everyone who lived with you last year. So the reason why why didn't this section say list your dependents? Because we don't want taxpayers to actually make the decision or try to make the decision as to who's a dependent and who isn't. That takes tax knowledge, that takes a counselor who's been trained. And so it's better to just have people list the people that live with them, and then we can make the decision one by one as to who's a dependent and who is not. So over here on the bottom right corner, as I mentioned in the other slide, this is where the counselor is going to fill out the information in the gray area to determine what the filing status is going to be for this taxpayer. So the client facilitator doesn't do anything with those gray blocks. That's taken care of when the taxpayer is finally meeting with a counselor. So let's move to page 2. So here's the page that I referred to where people are answering yes, no, or unsure as to all of these various sources of income or expenses or life events. You should become very familiar with this page, and you should become very familiar with each and every line on this page so that you're not sidetracked by any of these things. And you can be of great help to taxpayers if you have that knowledge in advance before sitting with them. So I suggest you sit down with this intake booklet and really become very, very familiar with it before the tax season begins. So let's move to page 3. So pages 3 and 4 of the intake booklet get into a variety of questions. Some of them, or actually a lot of them, are optional questions that the taxpayer can decide to answer or not answer, because they always have a choice called prefer not to answer. So they could just simply check that if they don't want to answer a particular question. The national questions, there are some questions that are put in there by the Internal Revenue Service, and those questions cannot be changed. There are other questions that the AARP has some control over, but the way the questions appear on the intake booklet now are probably the way they're going to be, at least for this year anyway. There's an additional comments section that we'll look at in just a second. I have an image of page 3. The additional comments section is used to provide additional tax-related information as a possible aid to counselors. So what we suggest is that everybody, all of the client facilitators, should really have a red pen so that anything that you put on the intake sheet is marked in red and can be quickly noticed by the counselor. And if you have anything that you think might be of additional help to the counselor, you may want to jot that in the additional comments section on page 3. There's several lines that allow you to put the information in there. Also, one thing I wanted to make note of is that I know at our site in Marshfield, on our appointment list, the list of appointments for the day, there is a comments section, and oftentimes our appointment taker has critical information that needs to be passed along to the preparer, and the client facilitator can be instrumental in making sure that that information gets passed along to the tax preparer. So if you see something on the appointment schedule, a notation that's tax related, and you think that it might be helpful to the counselor to have that information, please transfer that from the appointment sheet to the intake sheet so that the counselor will see. Otherwise, it's never going to make it to the counselor, and there might be something critical there that they should really have knowledge of. So be attentive to that, please. So here's what page 3 looks like, and you can see the additional comments section that I made a note here. Please use freely. The more information we give the counselors, the better. We want to make sure that they have enough information so that they can do a good job creating a tax return for this taxpayer. So there are questions on here relating to direct deposit, or does the taxpayer want to buy savings bonds with their refund? And also, how do they want to handle any payment that might be due? Maybe they're not getting a refund. Maybe they're faced with a payment due. Do they want that directly debited from their bank account or that kind of thing? So that's the top quarter of the page. And then after that, a variety of different questions that talk about race and various other things that some people just do not feel comfortable answering, so they can just click on prefer not to answer. Yeah. So that takes care of page 3. On page 4, we have more optional questions that are AARP related. The AARP Foundation is the one asking these questions. And depending on the answers that the taxpayer gives, the counselor, when they start doing the tax return, will actually take the information from the answer to these questions on page 4 and enter them into TaxSlayer. TaxSlayer has a similar group of questions, so that it's just a matter of transferring the information from the paper document to the electronic tax return. So some of the questions are: do you save part of your tax return last year, and last year meaning 2021? Do you rent or own your own home? What is your current gender identity? So there are a lot of some questions are more sensitive than others, and here again, they always have the ability to select prefer not to answer. So most of page 3 and all of page 4 are these optional questions. So here you can see page 4 and these optional questions that I referred to. On page 5, we have a page called How to Use This Intake Booklet. I'll show you that in a minute. But it's important that the client facilitator understands the purpose of each consent form and how to answer any taxpayer questions that they might have regarding them. So I suggest that you read page 5 thoroughly and understand how these consent forms are being used. I think they're pretty straightforward. When they first came out a couple of years ago, there was a lot of confusion about them, but they're now pretty easy to understand. I think the lawyers have done a good job of changing the language so that they're easier for the average person to understand. Preparation of the tax return is not conditioned on granting any of the consents in the intake booklet. So we should not be, as client facilitators, we should not be coaxing the taxpayer to either sign or not sign any of these consent forms. We need to be completely neutral. So the client facilitator should not be selling the taxpayer on one consent form or another by saying that, oh, I think this is a good one, you really ought to sign this. So it's completely up to them. They need to understand it on their own. You help them to understand it, but do not try to lead them towards signing or not signing. So here's what page 5 looks like, how to use this intake booklet. The taxpayer should read through this. You should read through this and be quite familiar with it. And it talks about the various consents, the 3 consents. Consent to disclose, the consent to disclose and use information. So there's 3 of them. We're going to get into them right now on an individual basis. Okay, consent number 1. Consent number 1 is the consent to disclose tax return information to VITA TCE tax preparation sites. So what this consent form does is it gives the taxpayer flexibility to use any site next year and have their basic information carried forward to the tax return at the site that they go to. So for instance, if somebody typically went to Marshfield and suddenly for one reason or another they decided to go to Scituate to have the tax return prepared, they would have had to have consented to this in the prior year in order for us, in order for the people in Scituate to get that basic information to come forward. Otherwise, Scituate would have to create the return brand new and enter all of the basic information such as name, address, telephone number, that kind of thing. So it would save a lot of time for a taxpayer not to have to enter, and also not only save time, but also lessen the chance that a mistake could be made by getting somebody's social security number wrong or getting their name or address incorrect, putting it into the tax return for the first time. So carrying the information forward from one year to the next is actually a pretty handy thing to have to prevent mistakes. So it gives the taxpayer flexibility to use any site next year, same site carry forward available with no consent. So if they don't consent at all, then they can always come to the Marshfield site, or if they always go to the same site every year and they don't really need the site information to carry forward to some other site later on, then that's fine. They don't have to sign that consent form, and they'll get the carry forward automatically at the site that they go to every year. Taxpayers and spouse sign the form if they agree to consent, but they both have to sign it. If one doesn't sign, then as far as the Tax-Aide is concerned, they have not consented as a couple. If not signed, the consent is denied. If the taxpayer does not consent, if the taxpayer does not want to consent to this, they don't have to sign at all. So if they've signed, they've consented to it. If they haven't signed, they have not consented. And here's what consent number 1 looks like. And you can read through that on your own, but it is pretty straightforward, and that's about it. Consent number 2. Consent number 2 is the consent to disclose information to the AARP Foundation, and it allows the TaxSlayer folks to share aggregated demographic data with the AARP Foundation. So this is not specific information about any particular taxpayer. It is information that the AARP needs and wants to collect about all of our taxpayers so that the AARP Foundation can get additional funding based on the number of people that we help each year. So by collecting this aggregated data about our taxpayers, it provides more money to the foundation. So the taxpayer and or the spouse sign the form if the consent is given. And here again, if not signed, the consent is denied. If only one spouse signs, the consent is denied. And if the taxpayer does not consent, then they do not need to sign. If the taxpayer does not want to consent, then no signature is required or expected. And here is an image of consent number 2. And again, it's pretty straightforward, and you might want to read through that on your own. We're going to be able to get these intake sheets to you before the season begins, so that you have a chance to go through them and look them over. And consent number 3 is the consent for the AARP Foundation to use select tax return information to provide you with additional information about other free AARP Foundation programs or services. The information is used to determine taxpayer eligibility for free programs and services offered by the AARP Foundation. So taxpayers typically are skeptical of this one because they don't really want information from the AARP, but the truth of the matter is that these are free services that the AARP Foundation offers, and are usually things that are extremely helpful to seniors, and some seniors more than others, but there are some really good programs out there. Things like getting your checkbook balanced by somebody, and just getting a little financial advice from somebody that has that background. Information is used to determine taxpayer eligibility for free programs and services offered by the AARP Foundation. Also, I think taxpayers need to know that the AARP Foundation is the charitable arm of the AARP. So I think some taxpayers are skeptical of AARP because of some of the insurance programs and things like that. But the AARP Foundation truly does care more about seniors in poverty than anything else, and so that's what these programs are aimed at. The taxpayer or the spouse sign the form if the consent is given. If it's not signed, the consent is denied. If only one signs, the consent is still denied. If the taxpayer does not consent, no signature is required or expected. The information shared includes such things as name, address, email address, phone number, and age, and also adjusted gross income. So it's basic information that gets passed along to the foundation, so that the foundation can perhaps send some information to this taxpayer about things that might be helpful to them. And here's an image of consent number 3. Once the intake booklet has been verified, gone through by the client facilitator, and all of the unsure answers have been changed to yes or no, or if the unsure answers need to be dealt with by the counselor, then so be it. The next thing is to deal with the taxpayers' documents that they've brought in. Their 2021 tax documents, their W-2s, their 1099s, that kind of thing. And so what we do is we sort the documents in the order that they appear on the 1040 form. So we start with income, followed by deductions, followed by credits. So we put all of these documents in this logical order based on how the counselor is actually going to prepare the tax return. The counselor is going to do income first, then they're going to do deductions, then they're going to do credits. So the client facilitator verifies that the documents are all for the current tax year, making sure that they're all 2021 documents. Oftentimes people bring us documents for a variety of tax years all mixed in together. Unfortunately, that's very time consuming to go through and sort out which ones are 2021, which ones are 2020 or 2019. Then we have some questionable documents that sometimes if you don't recognize a particular document, you might need to ask your local coordinator or an experienced counselor if there's one handy, as far as what the form is, whether it's something that we can do or not do. So you can see here that you need to identify the complex and out of scope tax returns. So if you see documents that don't look familiar. You need to ask questions, and we're going to determine whether these things are out of scope or not. What we don't want to happen is we don't want the taxpayer to go to a counselor, have the counselor start working on the tax return and find out an hour later that we found something that was out of scope, and it could have been found at the client facilitator station. So you need to be aware of that. Communicate possible complexity and scope issues to the local coordinator at the site. That's what the local coordinators are for. They need to make decisions on these things. Client facilitators don't make those decisions, but you need to bring it to the attention of the decision maker. Here's a job aid that we use in Marshfield. So a lot of our client facilitators have been a little concerned about how they should organize the documents for the current tax year. So this is called Recommended Document Order Tax Year 2021. So it's a suggested order of things by putting the intake and interview booklet on top, the client facilitator checklist, which is also another job aid. So these things are not anything that the AARP has developed. These are things that we've developed in Marshfield and we use for Marshfield. I'm not suggesting that anybody should use these particular tools that we use in Marshfield, but there certainly gives you an idea of some of the things that may be helpful. And they've been helpful to us over the years, so I'm happy to pass the information along, and you can create your own organizing things in the way that you want. So I know counselors like to get the documents in a particular order, and this is a helpful tool to get to that point. So client facilitators can also be very helpful in helping the local coordinator in assigning a particular taxpayer to a particular counselor following site procedures. So sometimes client facilitators have a good idea of what's a good fit as far as putting a particular taxpayer with a particular counselor. So that input should be provided to the local coordinator. And all the counselors are now trained on health savings accounts. In years past, we had to find somebody that had the background on health savings accounts. So they had to go to a particular counselor because some counselors had that knowledge, other counselors did not. Well, that's all gone away now. Everybody's trained in health savings accounts, so we don't have to differentiate one counselor from another. The client facilitator works closely with the local coordinator to keep the taxpayers comfortable, stress-free as possible, maintain a COVID-safe and healthy environment. So things like using disinfectants and things like that to clean up some of the areas periodically so that we don't have any risk of COVID going, being spread around. Other items are determined by the local coordinator as far as some of the tasks that the client facilitators can help local coordinators with. Be aware of site emergency procedures. So at your site, if it be a senior center or a library or wherever that might be familiar with the site emergency procedures that exist for that site so that if anything should happen, people are not just scrambling around with no idea of what to do. Every site is responsible for collecting daily activity information, and the local coordinator is responsible for reporting aggregate amounts of various things to the National Tax-Aide organization. So the AARP provides local coordinators with what's called an activity reporting, quality review, and ERO tracking log. So there's a page for each day, and if necessary, you can fill out a couple of pages if you have that much activity. So what's collected generally are the names of the various taxpayers that come to the site. Once the tax return has been assigned to a particular counselor, you'll note the counselor's initials on this page, the quality reviewer's initials when it gets to that stage. The return to be, whether a return is to be e-filed or paper filed, generally most of them are e-filed, but occasionally we do have some paper filed returns, and we need to keep track of those paper filed returns in a separate spot on the page. ERO tracking of the e-filed returns and the acknowledgements. So the electronic return originator, the person that does the e-filing each day, needs to keep track of the tax returns that are e-filed and also keep track of the acknowledgements when they come back from the Internal Revenue Service. But there's also something that the client facilitators can be very instrumental in keeping track of, and that's the tally of the questions only incidents. We oftentimes have people that come into the site and all they have is a question. They don't want their tax return done. They just have a question, or they have a question maybe regarding their tax return that they plan on having done at some later date. If we keep track of these questions only incidents and keep track of the number of them each day, it is very helpful to the AARP Foundation, again, to increase their funding, because they get their funding based on the number of people that we help each year. So we are helping people by answering their questions. And even though they don't get logged as a tax return when they have just a question, if we do keep track of them, the AARP can get additional funding as a result of that. So part of the activity log is keeping track of the questions only. So there is a column on that sheet that we need to use for keeping track of those incidents. Here is an image of the activity reporting log, and you can see that you have a spot for 15 taxpayers on here. Now it's quite conceivable that you could have more than 15 in a day, so you might have 2 pages filled out for a day. But this is what the log looks like. It really hasn't changed over the years, so every year we use this traditional log to keep track of our clients that we're dealing with, our taxpayers. There's also a back of this, and that's on the next slide. So here's the back of the activity log, and you can see that there are instructions to help the user to understand what's expected in the various columns and rows. So that makes it easier for people. So other things that can be useful at each site are things like addresses, telephone numbers for the local Social Security offices, or the addresses of where the local offices might be, other local city or state office phone numbers, addresses that might be needed or might be helpful to taxpayers, and a list of frequently used acronyms that we use at the sites that might confuse people. So there are lots of things that a client facilitator can do to make life easier for people at the site, and use your imagination. Here's a little quiz. Taxpayer asks if he has to report cash receipts from odd jobs. What do you do as a client facilitator? Well, you tell the taxpayer to discuss with the counselor. Once he gets set up with a counselor, tell the taxpayer to discuss it with the counselor. And the client facilitator never answers tax questions unless they are a certified counselor. And some client facilitators are certified counselors. So if you're not certified, you do not answer tax questions. You defer them to the counselor. Here's another little quiz. Taxpayer brings in last year's intake booklet and says nothing has changed. What do you do? I think I've answered this question in a slide earlier in the presentation. You inform the taxpayer that a new form must be completed every year, and you give them this year's Tax-Aide intake booklet to fill out. So that's the end of the presentation. I thank you very much for watching. Your service to taxpayers, the community, and the AARP Foundation deserves the highest praise. Thanks for all that you do to make the program successful. And remember, try to have a little bit of fun.